Hello, I'm David Palmer, and my background is in philosophy. I've spent time thinking about conceptions of tragedy, which broadly speaking is a dramatic depiction of the causes of human suffering, depictions of the way human lives go astray. In Beyond the Horizon, which he wrote in 1918, and which won him his first Pulitzer Prize in 1920, Eugene O'Neill intertwines three different visions of tragedy and invites the audience to join him in considering which of them is valid and how they are interconnected. O'Neill continues this exploration of the nature of tragedy throughout his career. It culminates in the famous plays he wrote at Dow House in Danville, California, 20 years after writing Beyond the Horizon. Such canonical classics as A Touch of the Poet, The Iceman Cometh, Long Day's Journey into Night, and A Moon for the Misbegotten. As you watch Beyond the Horizon and see the Mayo brothers and Ruth Atkins sink ever more painfully into suffering and the loss of their youthful dreams, pay attention to how various characters in the play explain the sources of this suffering. Each of these explanations is a theory of tragedy. Three broad approaches are presented in the play. The first is provided by James Mayo, the successful farmer who was Andrew and Robert's father, towards the end of Act 1, Scene 2, when Robert and Ruth announce that they plan to marry and stay on the farm, and Andrew decides to leave. Throughout the brothers' youth, the family has assumed that Ruth would marry Andrew, the older brother, who by both his manual skills and his practical temperament has strong potential to continue running the farm successfully as his parents age. Robert, on the other hand, the younger brother, seems unsuited for farming. More a dreamer with a taste for literature, he has planned to go to sea and explore the world with his uncle, a venture Andrew now pursues in Robert's place. Their father, James, is furious. He believes his sons are stepping away from who they naturally are and their natural places in the world. Each is trying to be something for which he is not fitted, and only failure and sorrow can follow. This idea of people being fitted by nature to some particular place in the world goes back to the ancient Greeks. It's depicted in Book 18 of Homer's Iliad, in the decoration on Achilles' shield, a great circular image depicting all the elements of the natural and the social world, each in its proper place in a well-ordered and harmonious cosmos. Stepping out of one's proper place leads to disharmony in this natural order, and the forces of justice inherent in the cosmos then punish the transgressor to bring the unity of the whole back into its proper balance. In this view, tragedy arises from being out of place in the natural order. O'Neill revisits this vision of tragedy 2 decades later in A Touch of the Poet, where the Irish immigrant tavern keeper Con Melody is seen by the wealthier Hartford family of the Yankee gentry as simply boorishly out of his natural place, as he tries to present himself as a gentleman and their equal. O'Neill, of course, rejects this view of a natural social order, and the play, in part, is his critique of the pretensions of social class, which attempt to envision arbitrarily adopted social mores as objective facts of nature. Nonetheless, this idea of tragedy as arising from being out of place with the natural order of the world is an underlying theme in A Touch of the Poet. A second vision in Beyond the Horizon of the source of our suffering is presented primarily by Ruth, although Robert also gives voice to it toward the end of the play. The culprit here is passion, a temporary and misguided desire that overwhelms our better judgment and truer emotions and leads us astray. Despite the joy they share in discovering their youthful love for each other, Robert and Ruth have an unhappy and unfulfilling marriage, and Ruth comes to regret the passions of her younger self that set the course for her life. The question Robert raises towards the end of the play is whether these passions can be controlled by human willpower or are like forces of nature, tornadoes or tidal waves, before which people merely are innocent victims, facing powers that inevitably overwhelm them. This notion of tragedy also has deep historical roots. Dante Alighieri completed the Divine Comedy in 1320. In his depiction of hell in the Inferno, he places people overcome by passion, such as Helen of Troy and the medieval adulterers Paolo and Francesca, in the second circle, just below those in the limbo of the first circle, which is reserved for what Dante calls virtuous heathen, such as Homer, Virgil, and medieval Muslim philosophers, whose only sin is failing to be Christian or baptized. The second circle is where suffering begins in the Inferno, and the punishment of these lovers is to be buffeted about eternally by a powerful wind, just as they were buffeted about by their passion in their lives. It is clear that Dante has sympathy for the sinners of this circle and believes they are nearly worthy of forgiveness, because the passion that destroyed them is also the source of the greatest and perhaps most noble of human joys. O'Neill revisits this vision of tragedy in the most famous closing scene in all his plays, Mary Tyrone's recollection of her schoolgirl dreams, having had a life that has left her with little else than disappointment and remorse. "What is it I'm looking for?" she says. "I know it's something I lost, something I missed terribly. I remember when I had it, I was never lonely or afraid. I can't have lost it forever, because then there would be no hope. I told Mother Elizabeth I wanted to be a nun, but she told me I must be more sure than that. That was in the winter of senior year. Then in the spring, something happened to me. Ah, yes, I remember. I fell in love with James Tyrone and was so happy for a time." A third vision of tragedy is raised at the end of Beyond the Horizon, when Robert confronts his older brother Andrew, who now has returned home to the farm. Robert suggests that the sadness that engulfed his and Ruth's life arose from forces they could not control, while Andrew's arose from free choices he made, driven by his own greed. This is the idea that tragedy arises from a faulty character trait, a fatal moral flaw. This is probably a misunderstanding of what Aristotle meant by hamartia in his analysis of tragedy in his book, The Poetics, but it nonetheless has become a standard approach in discussions of tragedy. We tend to think of King Lear as flawed by his vanity in demanding that his daughters announce their love for him. We see Macbeth as having flawed ambition and Othello as flawed by jealousy and his fragile sense of pride. As with the other two ideas about tragedy and Beyond the Horizon, O'Neill also revisits this approach in his late Powhouse plays. Consider Greed as a tragic flaw in More Stately Mansions, a play where O'Neill continues his critique of the social mores and values that he sees as sometimes warped into perversity by capitalism. So, O'Neill's early play, Beyond the Horizon, written when he was only 30, is an excellent window into his nascent ideas about tragedy that he will continue to explore and develop in his more mature works. We looked at three views of tragedy here, each of which has roots in the long literary tradition of Western culture. First, tragedy as being out of one's proper place in the natural order of the world. Second, tragedy arising from being overwhelmed by passion, in particular the joys and trials of love. And thirdly, tragedy arising from a moral or psychological flaw that warps the character's free will, but for which they nonetheless are personally responsible. Thank you for considering these conceptions of tragedy with me. I hope you enjoy Eric Fraser Hayes' production of O'Neill's first Pulitzer Prize-winning play. It's an excellent introduction to O'Neill's more mature works and ideas.